Ancient Egypt, a land of wonders and contradictions, an empire with knowledge advanced in architecture, astronomy and medicine, but also a place where the suffering, the idolatry and the brutality were part of the day by day. For some, it was the cradle of the civilization, for others, the most sinful nation in the Bible. But what? So, is this true? Was Egypt really a civilization doomed by its immorality? When we think about ancient Egypt, the first thing that comes to mind are its majestic pyramids, colossal temples and pharaohs wrapped in gold. However, few they know the dark background that was hidden behind its splendor. Biblical Egypt was not only a land of advancement and wealth, but also a place of excess, injustice, and oppression. The Bible it describes as an arrogant empire, where the false gods were worshipped with rituals bloody, and where the slavery was the basis of the economy. It was there where the town Hebrew suffered generations full of jobs forced, where Pharaoh's ruthless ordered the murder of innocent children, and where the laws were applied with cruelty unimaginable. But this is not just a biblical story, the history. It shows us that Egypt was a kingdom of extremes. The power of the pharaohs were absolute. They believed gods living and demanded obedience blind. The priests controlled the religion and politics, establishing a belief system based in the worship of thousands of deities, human sacrifices, inhuman punishments, and obsession with life after death. Death defined his society. God, according to the Bible, looked with anger the sin of Egypt. The plagues, the suffering, and the fall of the empire were interpreted as divine punishment. Moses challenged Pharaoh with a clear message, "Let my people go." But the Pharaoh hardened his heart, and his kingdom paid the price. Today we will reveal the darkest secrets from ancient Egypt, since the cruel punishments imposed by the law until the rituals most disturbing pagans, since the opulence of the palaces up to the misery of the slaves. Let's explore what life was really like in Egypt and why the Bible portrays it as a symbol of sin and rebellion. The revelations you will discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about this civilization. So get ready, because what you're about to learn will change your perspective forever. Welcome to Egypt, an empire of power, idolatry, and divine punishment. Egypt was the heart of the ancient world. Its cities, they were overflowing with wealth. Their temples stood as a tribute to the gods, and their pharaohs they ruled with absolute power. But how was this splendor sustained? Behind every colossal monument, behind every palace decorated with gold, there was thousands of slaves working until the exhaustion. The town Hebrew, according to the Bible, was the backbone of this machinery. Forced to mold mud bricks under the scorching sun, his hands were cracked, their bodies marked by the whip, and their souls broken by the weight of the hopelessness. There was no rest. There was no right to complain. Servitude was their only reality. The pharaohs saw themselves as gods. Their orders could not question, your desires were law, and its power had no limits. When they began to fear the growth of the town Hebrew, they made a radical decision to kill all the newly born men. The streets became in rivers of tears. Soldiers burst in homes Hebrews, snatched babies from the arms of their mothers, and that they threw without mercy to the Nile. It was a calculated act of extermination, a silent warning that the life of a slave had no value. Meanwhile, within the walls of the palaces, the nobility Egyptian lived surrounded by excesses. They delighted with exquisite banquets. They drank wines brought from lands distant and enjoyed entertainment endless. There was no concern for the suffering of the slaves. For them, the misery of the Hebrews was simply part of the natural order of the world. Egypt was an empire of contrasts. The majesty of its temples concealed the pain of those who they rose up. The opulence of their kings was built on the backs of the oppressed, but what seemed an unbreakable cycle was about to be challenged. Something was growing in the darkness, a force that would change the fate of the slaves and bring Egypt to its knees. The sun rose over Egypt, and with life was awakening in two opposite worlds. In the palaces, Egyptian royalty was involved in fine silks, perfumed their bodies with exotic oils, and began the day with a hearty breakfast: bread, honey, fresh fruit, and roast meat. Meanwhile, in the margins of the Nile, the slaves Hebrews rose before the dawn, with the body sore and the stomach emptiness. There was no rest, there was no choice. Egypt depended of the Nile as a body depends on your blood. Every year, your spate fertilized the fields and guaranteed abundant harvests. The Egyptians they saw in he a god, a sacred being who fed the nation. But those who truly they held he empire were not the gods, were the slaves. The streets of the city were bustling. Merchants shouted their offers in the markets. Priests performed rituals in golden and noble temples, were traveling in luxurious carriages. Meanwhile, the Hebrews transported stones, they manufactured bricks, and worked in the crops, supporting a whip of the foreman. One mistake, one pause, one sign of exhaustion, and the punishment was immediate. The Egyptian social hierarchy was rigid. The pharaohs they ruled with absolute power, followed by the priests and high officials who controlled the religion and the administration of the kingdom. Below were the artisans and peasants who lived with little, but at least with certain dignity. In he lowest rung, condemned to a life of suffering, were the slaves. The women Egyptians enjoyed more rights than in others, civilizations ancient. They could possess lands, manage businesses, and even influence politics. But one thing was the nobility, and other the reality of the women slaves. For them, the only certainty was the servitude. The day ended with the sunset, but rest was only for some. In the palaces, music and dance encouraged the nights. In the houses of the slaves, the only company was the exhaustion. But in middle of the darkness, a hope began to germinate, a spark of liberation that would soon ignite a flame unstoppable. In Egypt, the law was not just a set of rules. It was a reflection of the absolute power of the pharaoh, a tool designed to maintain he order and suffocate any challenge to the authority. It did not exist, It didn't exist the compassion, it only existed the punishment. The slightest of offenses could mean a ruthless sentence. A thief surprised stealing grain was condemned to death, amputation of a hand. A liar could receive 100 whiplashes in the public square. A servant who disobeyed his master could be branded with red-hot iron. But some crimes were punished with something even worse than the death. Betrayal of the pharaoh or the challenge to the gods were paid with eternal torment. The most feared punishment was condemnation to non-existence. Not only was the guilty party executed, but his name was erased from the records, his images destroyed, and their souls condemned to wander the eternity without rest. For the slaves Hebrews Tao, the law Egyptian was even more cruel. There was no trial, there was no defense. His life was worth less than the stone they carved. A back arched under the weight of a block of granite, a simple fainting from the stifling heat. Any sign of weakness could mean the death at the hands of a foreman. Public execution was a show. In the margins of the Nile, criminals, they were tied up and thrown into the crocodile-infested waters. In the sands of the desert, others were left to die of thirst. Some were buried alive, others burned in bonfires, while town observed in silence. But if the punishments were brutal, the rewards were luxurious. The scribes, architects, and priests who served good to the pharaoh, they were showered with riches and honors. Egypt did not forgive the weak, but he worshipped the loyal. Fear ruled he empire. Nobody was safe if he dared to defy the order established. But in the midst of this relentless system, something was about to break. The power of the pharaoh was not absolute, and soon all of Egypt would discover. In a world dominated by pharaohs and priests, the women Egyptians, they had more rights than in many others. Civilizations ancient. They could possess land, run businesses, and even divorce their husbands. Some, they reached positions of power, like Nefertiti and Hatshepsut. challenging norms imposed by a patriarchal system. But the reality was not the same for everyone. While the women nobles, they enjoyed luxuries and education, Great Most lived subject to the expectations of the society. Her primary duty was to marry and bear children. A woman without a husband, she was seen as a burden, and many were forced into arranged marriages from a young age. In the temples, the priestesses performed a fundamental role in the religion, participating in rituals and serving the gods. However, outside the nobility and the priesthood, the women of the town faced harsh living conditions. They worked in the fields, in weaving workshops, or as maids in the houses of the rich. For the slaves Hebrew, the situation was even more grim. They had no rights. They could not decline orders. They were property. Many were forced to serve in the palaces. Others, they worked in the construction or in the food production. They were vulnerable to the abuses of their masters, and there was no law that to protect. Egypt allowed some women came to power, but even those who rose, they knew that their authority depended from the support of the men. The domain of the pharaoh, it covered everything. Regardless of your status, the women lived in a society that kept under control, but that power structure was about to be challenged. Ancient Egypt was not only an empire of material greatness, but also a deeply spiritual world. Every aspect of life was dominated by the religion. There was gods for the sun, the fertility, the death, war, and even for writing. Since the pharaoh until the humblest peasant, all lived under the shadow of their deities. The Egyptian temples were fortresses of power and mysticism. Inside, priests performed secret rituals to appease the gods. They were offered offerings of gold, incense, and sacrificed animals. They were pronounced prayers in sacred languages, written on papyri hidden from the eyes of the people. But some rituals went beyond simple offerings. The burials royal were ceremonies full of symbolism and horror. It was believed that the pharaoh had to be accompanied in the another life, and for this, some were buried with their servants. They gave poison, or simply they were sacrificed, sealed inside the tomb, never to see the light of day again. The Egyptians, they believed that their gods could demonstrate in physical forms. Some animals were considered sacred. Cats were venerated and protected under penalty of death. Crocodiles were mummified and placed in temples. The bulls were sacrificed in ceremonies solemn, their bodies wrapped in linen and buried with more care than a human. But the idolatry of Egypt did not pass unnoticed by the eyes of God. According to the Bible, the faith of the Egyptians was based in false gods, and this would lead to his downfall. The confrontation between Moses and the Pharaoh's war was not just political, it was a spiritual war. Every plague sent upon Egypt was a direct attack on their beliefs. The Nile turned to blood, humiliated Hapi, god of the river. The plague of frogs challenged Heket, goddess of fertility represented by an amphibian. The darkness that covered the country by 3 days ridiculed Ra, the almighty god of the sun. And the last plague, the death of the firstborn, was a final blow to the heart of Egypt, demonstrating that neither his own Pharaoh, considered divine, could challenge the power of the true God. When the Hebrews they left Egypt, leaving behind a devastated nation. The temples were left in ruins, the gods, Egyptians were humiliated, and the Pharaoh lost what he loved most. The idolatry that had sustained the empire for centuries was his elderly weakness. Egypt never would be the one again same. Egypt was the ultimate symbol of human power. Its temples and monuments seemed eternal, its culture was unbreakable, and its pharaoh was seen as a god in the land. For centuries, nothing seemed to threaten his dominion, but every empire that challenges the divine, sooner or later, falls. The plagues not only destroyed Egypt physically, but also they demolished his spirit. The Nile, its source of life, became in a river of death. The darkness covered the earth, as if the own gods, Egyptians, would have disappeared. The last plague, the death of the firstborn, broke even the pharaoh. The ruler who had hardened his heart was finally seen, forced to give in. When the Hebrews they left, not only did they leave behind a devastated empire, they left behind centuries of oppression, idolatry, and suffering. What seemed impossible had been made reality. The town enslaved had defeated his oppressors without lifting a single sword. But Egypt did not accept his defeat. The Pharaoh, blinded by his pride, gathered his army and pursued the Hebrews to the Red Sea, a fatal decision. In the climax of the history, the waters that had been opened to give way to the slaves closed in on the Egyptian soldiers. The most powerful army of the time was destroyed in a single instant. The empire that defied God paid he price of your arrogance. He never regained the glory of his days golden. With his time, Egypt fell under the domain of others' empires. His religion lost strength, their gods were forgotten, and their temples were left ruined. But the history of Egypt is not just a story of the past. It is a reminder that earthly power, no matter how imposing it may seem, is never absolute. That the nations that rise up against the justice sooner or later will face your destiny. Biblical Egypt was a symbol of oppression, idolatry, and pride. His fall follows being one of the most impactful lessons of the history. But now, the question is for you. Do you think Egypt was really the most sinful empire of the Bible, or it was just another civilization trapped in his own greatness? Leave us your opinion in the comment and share this video with who love the mysteries of the history. See you in the next trip to the past.